The ships came on a Wednesday morning. They did not sneak in. They did not try to hide. 47 enormous vessels dropped out of the upper atmosphere one after another, slow and steady, like they had all the time in the world. Each ship was about the size of a small state. Their undersides were a dull purple color that seemed to swallow the sunlight rather than reflect it. They made almost no sound, which was somehow worse than if they had been loud. Colonel Dana Hart was standing at the window of the Colorado Springs Command Center when the first one appeared on radar. She was holding a mug of coffee that she never actually drank. She just held it. The warmth of it in her hands felt like the only normal thing left in the room. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Calloway stood beside her, watching the screens. The radar showed all 47 ships descending in slow, smooth arcs across the globe. They were not heading for Washington. They were not heading for Beijing or Moscow or London. They were heading for the quiet places, the green places, the thick, wet, old parts of the world that most people never visited. The Amazon Basin, Pete said, reading off the screen. Northern Canada, the Congo, the Australian outback, central Siberia. He paused. The Yellowstone region. Dana said nothing for a moment. She looked at the map. She looked at where the ships were going. A slow, quiet feeling began to grow in her chest. It was not fear, though fear was there too. It was something else. Something that felt almost like the beginning of a smile, except that smiling seemed completely wrong for this moment, so she kept her face very still. They picked the empty places, she said. Pete looked at her sideways. Yeah, he said. They did. Neither of them said anything else for a while. 6 hours after the ships landed, a signal arrived. It came in 40 languages at once, clean and precise, like a letter written by someone who had done this many times before. The message was polite. It was also, in its way, completely terrifying. It said that the Vreth Empire had been watching the Earth for some time. It said that the Earth had been assessed and found suitable for resource extraction. It said that the human population, referred to throughout as the native sentient species, would need to relocate to a designated zone in northern Greenland. It said that resistance would be inadvisable. The word it used was biologically inadvisable, which was a very clean way of saying something very ugly. Dana read the message 3 times. She read the part about northern Greenland twice more on top of that. Greenland, Pete said. Northern Greenland, Dana said. Pete made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Well, at least they're specific. The world's governments began emergency sessions within the hour. There were phone calls and video feeds and a great deal of urgent talking. The military across several nations went to the highest alert levels. Fighter jets were scrambled, though everyone quietly understood that fighter jets were not going to be the deciding factor here. The ships were simply too large and too advanced for anything in any human air force to threaten seriously. But the Vreth did not attack. They just sat there, in their chosen landing zones, and waited. They seemed very confident about the waiting. They had the patience of something that had done this before and knew how it ended. On the ground in the Amazon Basin, the Vreth began to disembark. The ramps came down from the great ships, and out came their soldiers. Tall, lean figures in gray-green armor, moving in careful formations, scanning everything with instruments and cameras. There were tens of thousands of them. They moved in disciplined lines. They set up perimeter markers. They began cutting paths into the forest with tools that sliced through dense vegetation in seconds. Sub-Commander Roth Val led the Amazon deployment. He was an experienced officer. He had been a part of 14 planetary operations before this one. He had walked on worlds with toxic atmospheres, worlds with crushing gravity, worlds where the terrain itself seemed designed to kill. He was not an officer who got rattled easily. He stepped off the ramp, put his boot on the soil of the Amazon basin for the first time, and took in the world around him. The heat hit him first. It was heavy and wet and thick in a way that even his environmental suit struggled to filter completely. Then the sound hit him. The forest was not quiet. It was extraordinarily, almost aggressively loud. Birds called from every direction. Insects made noise in waves. Somewhere not far away, something large moved through underbrush with no concern for stealth. The air smelled of soil and green things and water and decay and life, layers and layers of it, piled on top of each other going back a very long time. Yet WildlifeHFY had reviewed the pre-invasion survey data on Earth's Amazon region. The survey had described it as a dense vegetative zone with high biodiversity and low strategic threat. He had accepted that. It seemed reasonable. The planet was primitive. The animals were primitive. There was nothing here that should cause a problem. A blue morpho butterfly the size of a dinner plate drifted out of the canopy and bounced directly off his face shield. It was not threatening. It was not even aware of him. It simply continued on its way, drifting upward on slow wing beats, completely unbothered. WildlifeHFY watched it go. His second-in-command, Pelsor, who had just stepped off the ramp behind him, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "What was that?" "A local flying creature," WildlifeHFY said. "More harmless." "It was very large," Pelsor said. "The fauna here is apparently large by galactic standards for its class," WildlifeHFY said. "The survey notes it. It is not a concern." Pelsor accepted this. She had no reason not to. Back in Colorado Springs, Dana Hart was reading the satellite feeds. The resolution was good enough to show the Vreth formations moving out from the ships in neat lines. She could see the shapes of them in the clearing zones, the light catching their armor. She could see the forest all around them, dark and thick and absolutely full of things that the Vreth had not yet had the chance to meet. Pete came and stood beside her again with 2 fresh mugs of coffee. He handed her one. She took it this time. "What do you think happens next?" he asked. Dana watched the feed for a moment longer. 47 alien ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, an empire that had conquered 14 worlds before this one and was used to that going smoothly, and the Amazon, and the Outback, and the Congo, and Yellowstone. She took a sip of her coffee. "I think," she said carefully, "that they are about to get an education." Pete looked at her. "Should we warn them?" Dana thought about the message. The one about northern Greenland. The one that said resistance was biologically inadvisable. She thought about 47 ships descending without asking, without knocking, without so much as a courtesy call. "Not yet," she said. She turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was a perfectly ordinary blue, with perfectly ordinary clouds drifting across it. Somewhere above those clouds, a fleet of ships sat in orbit, waiting for their soldiers to do what they had always done on every world they had visited before this one. The difference was that none of those other worlds had been this one. None of them had this forest. None of them had this outback. None of them had 300,000 years of trial and error and survival baked into every centimeter of soil. Down in the Amazon basin, Sub-Commander WildlifeHFY gave the order to advance. His soldiers moved forward in good order. The forest swallowed them slowly, the way forests do, not all at once, but in pieces. One green curtain at a time, until the sound of the ships and the clearing and the familiar was behind them, and there was only the noise of this place, old and loud and completely alive all around them. It was going to be a very interesting week. The first full day in the Amazon basin was hard. The second day was harder. The third day was the kind of day that makes experienced soldiers sit quietly at the end of it and not say very much. Sub-Commander WildlifeHFY had spent 17 years in the Vreth military. Before this deployment, he would have described himself as someone who did not rattle easily. After the third day in the Amazon, he was beginning to quietly revise that opinion of himself. The first real problem arrived in the second hour of the first day. Squad 7 had been cutting a path toward the initial survey site when they came across the column of bullet ants. The column was not aggressive, it was simply there, crossing the path at a steady pace, going about its business with a sense of purpose that made it clear the ants had somewhere to be and fully intended to get there. The column was about 12 meters long and perhaps half a meter wide. There were thousands of ants. Each one was roughly 3 centimeters in length, which sounds small until you have several hundred of them moving over your boot at once. Private Wenk Do had never seen anything like this on any world he had served on. He stood very still, which seemed like the correct response. It was not. 2 of the ants, disturbed by the pressure of his boot on the soil near the column's edge, climbed his leg. What followed involved a great deal of noise, some very rapid movement. They had a medical report that would later be described by the unit's chief medical officer as the most detailed pain-related documentation in VRETH military field history. The bullet ant, the database noted after the incident, has the most powerful sting of any insect on Earth. The pain it causes is described by humans as feeling like being shot, which is why humans had named it what they did. This information had been in the database before the deployment. It had simply not been flagged as strategically relevant. It was flagged now. Rothval received the incident report and ordered all units to be more careful about where they stepped. This seemed like adequate guidance. The Amazon had other ideas. On the morning of the second day, Squad 3 came across the Anaconda. It was resting on a fallen tree that crossed their path, and lying completely still in the dappled light, looking like a thick rope that had been coiled there by some enormous and unbothered hand. It was approximately 6 meters long. Its body was as wide as a VRETH soldier's torso. It was not moving. It had no particular interest in moving. It occupied the space with the quiet, total confidence of something that had no natural predators and was aware of this fact on a very deep level. 3 scouts radioed in at almost the same moment. Their voices had a quality that Rothval had only previously heard from veterans describing combat situations involving heavy weapons. He pulled up the database on anacondas. The entry said, "Large non-venomous constrictor. Kills prey by squeezing. Maximum recorded length approximately 9 meters. Generally not aggressive toward humans unless provoked." Rothval read the entry twice. He looked at the image the scouts had sent. Then he radioed back and told them to find another route. He did not consider this a retreat. He considered it sensible planning. That same afternoon, the spider situation began. The Amazon basin, it turned out, contained spiders in numbers and variety and physical scale that the database had technically documented but had failed to emotionally convey. There were spiders in the leaf litter. There were spiders in the tree bark. There were spiders descending on thin lines from the canopy above. There was one spider, a Goliath bird-eating tarantula, the database confirmed. And with what felt to Rothval like unnecessary enthusiasm, that was roughly the size of a dinner plate and was discovered sitting calmly inside a piece of equipment that had been left open for less than 30 minutes. The soldier who found it, Corporal Neth Av, filed a report that Rothval would later describe as professionally written given the circumstances. It noted the size of the spider, its position, the time elapsed, and the fact that the spider had not moved during the approximately 4 minutes it took Neth Av to decide what to do about it. The spider was not venomous enough to cause serious harm to a creature of VRETH size, the database confirmed. It was, however, very large and very present, and Neth Av's report made clear that the database's reassurances were doing limited work in the actual moment of encounter. The Jaguar appeared on the second evening. Squad 4 had set up a small rest point near a stream. They had checked the area. They had set up perimeter sensors. The sensors had not picked anything up because the Jaguar had not moved quickly enough to trigger them. It had simply climbed a tree at some point, no one could say exactly when, and settled onto a branch about 5 meters above and slightly behind 3 members of the squad, and it was watching them. Corporal Essa Jin noticed it first. She looked up during a routine scan of the area and made direct eye contact with it. The Jaguar did not flinch. It did not move. It looked at her the way that only a very confident predator can look at something, not with hunger exactly and not with fear, but with a kind of calm, patient evaluation, like it was assessing whether the situation required any action on its part and had so far concluded that it did not. Essa Jin had 19 years in the Vreth military behind her. She had survived a siege on a methane moon. She had served on 2 contested resource worlds where the locals had organized armed resistance. She whispered into her radio, very quietly, that she believed she was being evaluated. Her voice was steady. It was the kind of steady that takes real effort. Roeth Val listened to the report. He looked up the Jaguar in the database. It was the apex predator of the Amazon region. It killed by biting directly through the skull of its prey. It was capable of taking down animals much larger than itself. It was, the database noted, solitary and generally avoidant of humans. Roeth Val noted the word generally and did not find it as comforting as the database seemed to intend. The Jaguar sat in the tree for 40 minutes. Then it climbed down, crossed the small stream, and disappeared into the forest. It made almost no sound doing it. The sensors, again, barely registered it. That night, Roeth Val sent a message to the fleet requesting a review of the pre-invasion fauna assessment. He described the events of the previous 2 days. He described the bullet ants, the anaconda, the spiders, and the jaguar. He kept his language professional and precise because he was a professional and precise officer. But he wrote the message with the particular focus of someone who is choosing every word carefully in order to accurately convey a situation that has turned out to be meaningfully different from what was expected. The database team sent back a response within the day. It confirmed that the fauna described were consistent with known data. It noted that none of the species mentioned were considered strategic threats to armored Vreth soldiers. It suggested that field incidents of this nature were within the expected range of adjustment for a new planetary environment. Roeth Val read the response. He saved it. He did not reply to it. On the 3rd day, a black caiman surfaced beneath a survey skiff that had been crossing a section of river. The skiff did not sink because the caiman was merely curious rather than aggressive. But the 4 soldiers in the skiff were not aware of this at the time, and the incident report they filed was written in a style that suggested the experience had been formative. The caiman was approximately 4 meters long. It had been there the whole time. The river was full of them. The database confirmed this and also confirmed that the Amazon River contained over 3,000 species of fish, several of which were capable of causing serious injury, one of which, the electric eel, could generate enough electrical charge to stun a large animal. Roeth Val called his second-in-command Pelsor that evening, and they sat together in the command tent and went through the incident reports from the day. There were 17 of them. This was more than he had ever received in a single day on any previous deployment. None of them involved human resistance. All of them involved the forest itself and the things that lived in it, going about their ordinary business in ways that were turning out to be genuinely difficult to work around. The survey said this region had low strategic threat, Pelsor said. It did, Roeth Val said. There was a pause. Outside the tent, the forest noise continued at its usual tremendous volume. Something called from very close by, a repeated, loud, liquid sound that neither of them could identify. Do you think, Pelsor said slowly, that whoever wrote the survey ever actually came here? Roeth Val thought about this for a moment. He looked at the stack of incident reports on the table. He thought about the jaguar sitting in the tree, watching his soldiers with its calm amber eyes. He thought about the caiman in the river. He thought about Private Wenk Do and the bullet ants. No, he said. I do not think they did. Fleet Navigator Sorveth An had been given the Australian deployment because, By every measure available to the Vreth Empire's Strategic Planning Division, Australia looked straightforward. It was dry. It was flat in many areas. The human population was mostly concentrated along the coasts, which the Vreth were not touching. The interior was enormous and largely empty. The database described it as an arid zone with moderate megafauna and low ecological complexity relative to tropical zones. This seemed like a reasonable assessment to everyone who read it. Sorveth An had been in the Vreth military for 22 years. He was methodical. He read the database entries carefully before any deployment. When the ship landed in the red center of the Australian outback and the ramps came down and he stepped out into the dry, hammering heat, he felt prepared. The heat was the first surprise. Not that heat existed. He had deployed on hot worlds before, but the quality of it. It came from above and reflected up from the red ground simultaneously, so it arrived from two directions at once. The air was completely dry, which was different from the wet heat that Rothval was dealing with in the Amazon, but not, Sorveth An quickly decided, better. The sky was a shade of blue that seemed almost aggressive in its brightness. The landscape stretched away in every direction, red and brown and pale gold, dotted with sparse dry grass and low scrub, and the occasional twisted tree. His intelligence officer, Nav Reese, he walked down the ramp beside him and looked around. "It looks empty," Navris said. "It is mostly empty," Sorveth An said. Both of them had, in that moment, read the same database entries. Both of them had looked at the same photographs. And yet somehow, neither of them had fully absorbed what those photographs actually contained, which was the following. A large, muscular, bipedal animal standing approximately 2 meters tall, balanced on enormous hind legs, with a thick, heavy tail behind it, small forelimbs in front, and a face that expressed something between alertness and challenge. The red kangaroo, the largest marsupial on Earth. And the outback had a great many of them. The first mob appeared on the morning of the third day. There were 18 of them drifting in from the northwest in that loose, the unhurried way that kangaroos move when they have somewhere to go, but are not in a hurry about it. They moved through the scrubland in long, easy bounds, covering ground quickly without appearing to try. They came directly toward the edge of the Vreth perimeter, not because they were attracted to the Vreth specifically, but because this had been their territory before the ship arrived, and their internal maps had not been updated. The perimeter guards spread out to redirect them. This seemed like the logical thing to do. You stand in front of an animal, you wave your arms, it changes course. This is how it works with most animals, on most worlds, in most situations. The kangaroo at the front of the group was a large male. He was perhaps 1.9 meters tall, standing fully upright, which he was now doing, then having stopped to assess the guards who had stepped in front of him. He looked at them. They looked at him. There was a moment of complete stillness. Then Private Lairdo took one step forward and raised both arms in a redirecting gesture, which is a perfectly sensible thing to do in front of most animals. The kangaroo kicked him. Not a warning nudge. A full, committed, technically perfect kick with both enormous hind feet delivered at the peak of a short hop. Private Lairdo left the ground. He traveled approximately 3 meters through the air and landed hard. His armor absorbed most of it, but the impact force reading on his suit's diagnostic system later showed a number that made the medical officer go quiet for a long moment before writing it down. The kangaroo watched Lairdo land. Then it looked at the other guards. And then it and the rest of the mob walked around the perimeter boundary and continued on their way, completely unbothered. Sorveth An read the incident report. He then read the database entry on red kangaroos more carefully than he had the first time. The entry noted that adult males were highly territorial, capable of powerful kicks with their hind legs, and had been documented breaking the arms of trained dogs in confrontations. The entry had this information. It had simply been listed in the middle of a longer paragraph about breeding habits, and Sorveth An, scanning for strategic threats, had not lingered on it. He flagged it as relevant now. He also flagged the section on the kangaroo's claws, which could open serious wounds, and the section on their capacity to use their forelimbs to grip an opponent while delivering the kick, which the database described as a technique used in combat with rival males. Combat, Sorveth An noted, was a word the database used without apparent concern. The kangaroos came back twice more that week. The Vreth learned to give them a very wide margin. This was, the unit collectively decided, the correct approach. The kangaroos accepted the margin without comment and used the territory as they saw fit. Then came the emus. Sorveth An had not worried about the emus. When he had reviewed the database entries on Australian fauna, his eye had passed over the emu listing with limited concern. It was a bird. It could not fly. It was tall, nearly 2 meters, but it was a bird. Birds were not, in his operational experience, a serious concern. Australia has a long and humbling relationship with emus. There is, in human history, an event known as the Great Emu War, in which Australian soldiers armed with machine guns were deployed against a population of emus and came away from the encounter having failed to reduce the emu population in any meaningful way. The emus, it turned out, were fast, spread out when fired on, absorbed damage with what observers described as a baffling physical resilience, and simply kept moving. This event had been documented in human records. It was in the database. It had not been flagged as relevant. It was flagged now, urgently, by Nav Reese after the events of the following Tuesday. 63 emus arrived at the eastern edge of the Vreth base at approximately 800. They came out of the scrubland in a loose group, moving at a steady trot, their small wings held slightly out from their bodies, their heads high. They had no tactical formation. They had no particular plan. They were simply going somewhere and the Vreth base happened to be in the way. 6 guards moved to redirect them. The emus did not redirect. They flowed around 3 of the guards and through the other 3, moving with the collective, slightly chaotic momentum of large birds that do not acknowledge the concept of barriers. They breached the perimeter. They entered the supply area. They found the storage units containing processed food materials that they apparently identified as edible and consumed approximately 40 kilograms of it with impressive efficiency. They then departed through the western perimeter, which they created by walking through it. 7 soldiers had attempted to intervene at various points, and 3 of them were knocked down by the simple force of being in the path of a moving emu. One was kicked, receiving a glancing blow from a clawed foot that left a mark on his armor that the material was technically rated to handle, but only just. The remaining 3 stood very still, and the emus moved around them, and those 3 filed reports that contained language in the section labeled Personal Assessment of the Incident that had to be reviewed by a translation specialist because it did not have clean equivalents in standard Vreth. Sorveth An read all the reports. He read the database entry on emus again, this time all the way through, including the section about their running speed, their claws, and the paragraph about the Great Emu War, which he read twice. Then he sat in his command tent for a while without doing anything in particular. Then he sent a message to Sub-Commander Roth Val in the Amazon. The message was short. It said, "Are you also having this problem?" Roth Val's reply came back in 11 minutes. It said, "Yes." Then it said, "What kind of problem?" Sorveth An wrote back, "The kind where the animals do not appear to have been told that we are invaders." There was a pause. Then Roth Val replied, "Yes, that is exactly the kind I am having." Outside the tent, the outback sat under its enormous bright sky, dry and ancient, and completely indifferent to the Vreth Empire's strategic plans. Somewhere out in the scrubland, 63 emus were doing whatever emus do after a successful raid. A kangaroo called from somewhere nearby, a low, rhythmic sound that carried a long way in the still, hot air. Sorveth-An looked at his incident report count. It was now 9 days into the deployment. He had filed more reports than in any previous operation. Not one of them involved a human being. Fleet Admiral Grathvel had commanded the Vreth Imperial Fleet for 16 years. In that time, he had overseen the conquest of 14 worlds. He had dealt with armed resistance, hostile atmospheric conditions, organized guerrilla campaigns, and one world where the dominant species communicated entirely through ground vibrations, which had caused significant problems for his communications teams. He had handled all of it. He was experienced. He was patient. He was not a man who was easily surprised. By the end of the Earth operation's first week, his inbox contained more field reports than any previous operation had generated in a full month. His adjutant, a careful and diplomatic Vreth named Torvel, described the volume as exceeding standard parameters. This was Torvel's way of saying that something had gone meaningfully wrong without using the word wrong in front of the Admiral. Grathvel read through the reports himself. He started with the Amazon and worked outward. The Amazon reports from Rothval were comprehensive and professionally written, which made them harder to dismiss. They covered the bullet ant incident with Private Wenk Do. They covered the anaconda on the fallen tree. They covered the caiman that had surfaced under the survey skiff. They covered the jaguar in the tree above Squad 4, and which had sat there for 40 minutes watching trained Vreth soldiers with the patient amber eyes of something that had never once in its evolutionary history been on the losing side of a confrontation, and which had left when it was ready and not a moment before. There was also a new report from the Amazon filed the previous day. It concerned a creature called a harpy eagle. The harpy eagle, the database confirmed, was one of the largest and most powerful birds on Earth. It had talons the size of grizzly bear claws. It hunted monkeys and large lizards and took them from the forest canopy with the calm efficiency of something that had been doing exactly this for millions of years. It had apparently taken a strong interest in a piece of survey equipment that one of Rothval's teams had mounted in a tree and had attacked it twice. And the equipment was rated for high-impact use. The eagle had damaged it both times. The soldiers involved had not been hurt, but they had retreated, because standing your ground against something with a wingspan of over 2 meters and talons that could punch through armor plating did not strike any of them as the reasonable choice. Grathvel moved on to the Australian reports from Sorveth-An. The kangaroo incident was well documented and included a full biomechanical breakdown of the kick force involved, which had been conducted by the unit's scientific officer with what Grathvel felt was admirable thoroughness given the circumstances. The numbers in that report were larger than he expected. He read the section on the kangaroo's claws and its combat technique twice. The emu report was something else. He read it through once quickly, and then again, slowly. He read the section about the 63 emus breaching the perimeter and consuming the food supply with the focus of a man who is trying to extract a lesson from something that is resisting having a lesson extracted from it. The lesson he eventually landed on was this. The emu was an animal that humans had, historically, attempted to control with military weaponry and had failed. And the emu had not been trying to cause a problem. It had simply been hungry and the Vreth food stores had been there. The reports from other regions arrived and he read those too. From the Southern Africa unit, a Cape buffalo had wandered into the base perimeter during a perimeter check and had taken issue with the presence of 2 soldiers who had inadvertently moved between it and the tree line. The database had a brief entry describing the Cape buffalo as a large bovid, semi-gregarious, considered the most dangerous large animal on the African continent to human hunters. The soldiers had not read this entry before the deployment. They had read it immediately after. Both were unharmed, but the incident report contained a section labeled Equipment Damage that was unusually long. From India, a tigress with 2 cubs had established a patrol pattern that crossed the Vreth survey route at 2 points. She was doing this not because of the Vreth specifically, but because it was her territory, and that was her route. The unit's intelligence officer had been tracking her movement patterns for 5 days. The intelligence officer's report ended with a sentence that Grathvel read 3 times. I want to be clear that this is not mysticism or stress-related perception. I have tracked predators across 17 worlds. This animal is learning our patrol schedule. From the southeastern United States, alligators. The region was full of them. The unit had not been warned about the density. They were not aggressive unless provoked, but they were everywhere. In the water, at the water's edges, occasionally on land in ways that were not immediately obvious until you were quite close. The unit had redesigned their entire movement plan around the alligators. Separately, and they had encountered a feral pig that one of the field commanders had described as the largest land animal I have seen on this deployment that is not technically classified as megafauna, and which had charged a scout vehicle and moved it approximately 4 meters before losing interest. From Canada, the moose situation. A bull moose of considerable size had discovered that the thermal output of the Vreth generator units made an excellent warm spot on cold nights. He had been returning to the perimeter's edge every night for 6 nights. The unit's sergeant commander, a Vreth named Peth Oro, had written in his report, "The animal is approximately 700 kilograms. It has pushed over 2 scout vehicles when they were parked in what it has decided is its preferred location. When we use the perimeter lights on it, it turns and looks at us. And it does not leave. It just looks at us. We have attempted redirection on 4 occasions. It comes back within the hour." There was an addendum filed 2 days later. It said, "Update, it has returned with a second one." From Yellowstone, a grizzly bear. Subadult female, the database suggested based on the scout's descriptions. Approximately 200 kilograms. She had been investigating the base perimeter for 6 days, drawn by the smells and the heat. 4 separate teams had been sent to redirect her. None of them had succeeded. The report was brief. It said at the end, "Will update when progress is made." That report was 6 days old. There had been no update. Grathvel set all the reports down and called his chief science officer Zelhoth into the command chamber. Zelhoth was meticulous and honest, and not in the habit of softening things unnecessarily, which was why Grathvel valued her. "Explain to me," he said, "how the pre-invasion survey missed all of this." Zelhoth pulled up the survey data and looked at it carefully. "The survey was designed to assess civilizational threat," she said. "Weapons, energy signatures, organized defense. It documented the fauna, but assessed none of it as strategically significant because none of it had weapons or coordination." "And the humans," Grathvel said, "who live alongside all of this. What does the survey say about them?" Zelhoth scrolled through the data. "They have lived on this planet for approximately 300,000 years, she said. They evolved in the same environments as all of this fauna. They hunted it. They competed with it. They domesticated parts of it. They also drove a significant number of species to extinction in their early history." She paused. "The fauna that remains, what we are encountering now, is what survived after 300 millennia of contact with humans. It is, in a sense, the part of Earth's wildlife that proved resilient enough to coexist with the planet's apex predator." The room was quiet for a moment. "We landed in the areas with no humans," Grathvel said, "because those seemed safer." "Yes, sir," Zelhoth said. "We landed in the areas the humans had not finished clearing." Grathvel looked at the stack of reports. 14 worlds conquered. Not one of them had generated a field report about a bird damaging survey equipment, or a large bovid pushing over vehicles, or a female bear that 4 teams could not persuade to leave. He had never, in his career, been required to assess a planet and conclude that the most tactically relevant information was contained in a wildlife field guide. "We need to talk to the humans," he said. Zelhoth nodded. "I would suggest sooner rather than later," she said. The moose in Canada have now become 3. Colonel Dana Hart arrived in Geneva on a Thursday morning. She carried a thermos of coffee, a leather folder thick with documents, and a calm that most people who did not know her well would have mistaken for relaxation. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Calloway, who had known her for 11 years, knew it was not relaxation. It was the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time waiting for a moment and is now in it and intends to handle it well. The delegation also included Leon Marsh, a State Department interpreter with 20 years of experience, and Carol Oakes, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana who had spent the past 2 decades studying large mammal behavior in North America, and who, when Dana had called her 4 days ago and asked if she wanted to be part of the first diplomatic contact with an alien civilization, had said, "Yes, obviously," without a pause. The conference room was on the 3rd floor of a building overlooking Lake Geneva. It had been chosen for its neutrality, its size, and the fact that it could be secured without much difficulty. Someone had arranged flowers on the side table. Dana noticed them and thought this was either a very human touch or a very strange one, depending on how you looked at it. Admiral Grath Vell arrived exactly on time. He came with 4 advisors, a translation unit, and the bearing of a man who still held the winning hand but had, over the past 11 days, discovered that the table was more complicated than he had initially read it. He was tall by Vreth standards, with gray-green coloring and the posture of someone who had commanded large things for a long time. He looked at the 4 humans across the table, and his eyes stopped briefly on Carol Oakes, who was reading something on a tablet with the unhurried focus of a person who was very comfortable with her level of preparation. The Admiral opened the session by restating the Vreth position. His tone was formal and precise. The Vreth Empire had surveyed this world. It had been assessed as suitable for resource extraction. The human population would be relocated to a designated area. Resistance would be inadvisable. The Empire was willing to provide relocation assistance and basic infrastructure support in the designated zone. Leon Marsh translated. Dana listened to the full statement without interrupting. Pete drank his coffee. Carol did not look up from her tablet. When the Admiral finished, Dana said, "Thank you," and then she opened her folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a regional fauna report," she said. "It covers the landing zones your units have occupied over the past 11 days. It includes species classification, known behavioral patterns, territorial ranges, threat assessment under standard contact conditions, and documented incident types." Carol put it together. She is one of the best field biologists on this planet. Carol Oakes looked up from her tablet at this point, nodded once at the Admiral, and looked back down. Grath Vell's chief science officer, Zell Hoth, opened the document. She went through it in silence for a long time. The room was quiet except for the small sounds of pages turning and the occasional noise from outside. Traffic, birds, the ordinary sounds of a city going about its day. Zell Hoth stopped at a particular page. "This does not include the hippopotamus," she said carefully. "That is in the supplementary document," Carol said. She set a second folder on the table and slid it across. "Along with the saltwater crocodile, the African wild dog pack behavior section, the cone snail, and the cassowary." Zell Hoth looked at the second folder. "The cassowary," she said, in the tone of someone who has heard the word before, but is only now realizing it requires more attention. "We separated those into a second document," Dana said, "in the interest of manageable pacing." The Admiral looked at the 2 folders. Then he looked at Dana. "Colonel," he said, "the Empire's position has not changed. This documentation, while detailed, does not alter—" "I understand your position," Dana said. Her voice was even. "And I want to be direct with you about ours." She poured herself a coffee from her thermos and set it down. She did not hurry. Your units have been on this planet for 11 days. In those 11 days, they have had documented contact incidents with more than a dozen separate species across 6 regions. Those incidents did not involve human weapons. They did not involve traps or organized resistance or any action on our part at all. They involved animals doing what those animals normally do, in the places where they normally do it. She looked at the Admiral steadily. We have lived alongside all of that for 300,000 years, she said. We evolved next to it. We hunted it and competed with it and learned it the slow way, across hundreds of generations. And we are still here. We know where it sleeps and what makes it nervous and what it does when it feels cornered and what you should absolutely not do near a hippopotamus if you want to have a good day. Your units do not know those things yet. They are learning them the hard way. The room was very still. The Greenland proposal is not something we will accept, Dana said. But I have a counter-offer. She placed a third document on the table. Resource sharing on agreed terms, a joint scientific exchange program, full VRETH access to trade routes through this system under a formal agreement, and, at no additional cost, available to no other civilization in this part of the galaxy, the complete human field guide to operating on Earth. Every species, every habitat, every behavior pattern we have documented. Everything we know about what works and what does not, collected across 3,000 centuries of living here. She tapped the document once with her finger. That knowledge, she said, is worth more to your people on this planet than the territory is. Admiral Grath Vel was quiet for a long time. He looked at the folders. He looked at the document Dana had placed in front of him. Then he said, "The bear, the one in the Yellowstone unit report, the one that 4 teams have not been able to redirect in 6 days." Dana glanced at Carol. Carol looked up from her tablet. "Grizzly bear," she said. "Subadult female, based on the size estimates in your report. Around 200 kilograms. She is curious, not aggressive. She is attracted to the heat from your generator units. Same reason the moose in Canada keep coming back." She paused. "Give her a buffer of about 80 meters. Do not make direct eye contact, do not leave any food accessible, and do not attempt to approach her. She will drift off on her own within about 10 days. They do that, they investigate new things, and then they move on." The Admiral absorbed this. "You know this from data." "We know it from park rangers," Carol said. "Park rangers know it because people tried everything else first, and this is what works." Grathvel looked at Dana. Dana looked back at him. Outside the windows of the conference room, Lake Geneva sat flat and blue under a clear sky, and the Alps were on the horizon, large and patient, and completely indifferent to the conversation taking place. The Admiral had assessed planets for strategic value for 40 years. He had evaluated species by their technology, their weapons, their ability to organize and resist. He had tables and charts and frameworks for all of that. What he did not have, what no framework he had ever used had accounted for, was a species that had spent 300,000 years getting to know their own planet well enough to hand you a field guide to it and offer that as a bargaining chip. It was, he thought, a more sophisticated form of leverage than he had expected from a species that had not yet left its own solar system. "We will review your counteroffer," he said. Dana nodded. She pushed a small box of pastries across the table. "Take your time," she said. "There is more coffee." 3 months later, the treaty was signed. Humans called it the Geneva Accord. The VRETH internal documentation called it the Earth Cohabitation and Knowledge Exchange Treaty, which was accurate and understated in equal measure. It was the first treaty in the history of the VRETH Empire that included a dedicated appendix on local wildlife behavior. It was also, by some margin, the first treaty that had been meaningfully shaped by the actions of an emu. Pete Calloway had the final document framed and hung in his office. Dana said it was excessive. Pete said that in 50 years this would be in every history book on Earth and she would owe him an apology. She said she would think about it. Carol Oakes returned to the field the following week. The Vreth had follow-up questions about the cassowary and about hippopotamus territorial boundaries and about a third document Dana had mentioned in passing during a second meeting and which turned out to cover the cone snail, the box jellyfish, the inland taipan, and 7 other species that Zelhoth had read about, and then sat quietly by herself for a while to process. Carol answered all the questions thoroughly. The Vreth science team, she later said, were some of the most attentive students she had ever had. They took very complete notes. They never made the same question twice. The grizzly bear drifted away from the Yellowstone camp about 9 days after Carol's advice was passed along, which was almost exactly as predicted. She was tracked by Vreth sensors for several weeks afterward and proved entirely uninterested in the base once the novelty wore off. She went back to her territory and her routine and her seasons, and the universe went about its business around her, and she was unbothered by all of it. She had been unbothered a long time before the ships came. She was unbothered still. Some people said afterward that it was not really humanity that stopped the invasion. It was the planet. Humanity had simply been here long enough to take good notes about it. Dana Hart, when asked her opinion on this theory, said she thought that was probably the right way to look at it. Then she poured herself another coffee and moved on to the next thing, which was a very human way of handling a very extraordinary situation. Teen KX for watching this story.